So hello, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Gianmarco Cristofari. I am a lawyer and a PhD student in global studies at the University of Macerata, Italy. And I'm here today to introduce this project and this book. It's called The Politics of Platformization, Amsterdam Dialogues on Platform Theory. So now the event will be divided in two parts. In the first part, for about 20 minutes, I will make an introduction, present some of the findings, some of the context of the book. And then we will have a roundtable and a discussion on the politics of platformization in the European Union, especially this Amsterdam-based research. So, let me start by thanking the many people that made this project possible. So first of all, the Institute of Network Cultures and Gert Lovink, who is my partner in crime in all of this, and who allowed me to spend 1 year among the beautiful canals of this city. Second, I'd like to thank the Institute for Information Law, where I could spend a very valuable time, which is at the UvA faculty. Then I'd like to thank all the authors. So we have Thomas Puel, Gert Lovink, Stefania Milan, Anne Elmond, Letizia Chiappini, Balázs Bodo, Niels Tonover, Niels Van Doorn, Paddy Larsen, Martijn de Waal, Davide Beraldo, and Giovanni Rossetti. My friends, thanks so much to Valeria Ferrari, and then to Alexandra Giannopoulou, to Jordi Guerrero, to Nicola Zengaro, to Marco Dallago, and all the others. Thanks to Global Digital Culture for funding the project. Thank you so much. We have some copies of the book which are available here. You can take your copy if you like. Who else do I have to thank that I forgot? So today we are going to have this this panel. Actually, we were supposed not to be only white males, but Professor Milan, she will come here later because she's teaching. Anne Elmond is actually, she told me she has COVID, so she will not be here. So we have only Letizia Chiappini, who will be the representative today of the non-white male speakers. I'd like to make this presentation a little bit fun, entertaining, not so much academic. So I start with an anecdote, and it was during the pandemic in 2020, and I was at home starting to do my PhD research on the power of platforms. And basically, I said, why don't I read every book with the word title with the word platform in the title? And then it turned out there were a little bit too many. So I wrote an email to Gert Lovink. I had read his book, Set by Design, which was a good book. And so we started discussing, and I came to Amsterdam, and we came up with the idea of these interviews. And so thank you, everybody, for accepting this random Italian, asking you some questions about platforms. So we have a book made of 12 interviews, plus an introduction, plus a final essay, and some beautiful illustrations by Carlotta Artioli. And these interviews are all about platformization. So what we've witnessed in the recent years is that many research fields had to deal with this phenomenon. So the interviews are actually, it's always platformization declined according to some one area. So for example, we have network theory, we have infrastructure study, we have social movement studies, we have critical data studies, and so on and so forth. But all the interviews, they start with the same question, which is, what is a platform? Which is a rather provocative question because it's a contested concept, of course. And so it's about the semantics of the word platform. And so my idea was to start from a very frivolous exercise, which is from Latin etymologies. That's something I don't see so much here in the Netherlands, but in Italy they're kind of a thing. And so the things I've selected are 6 keywords, right? Those are kind of recurring keywords of the platform discourse. One is public, one is infrastructure, one is cybernetics, one is map, one is institution, and one is responsibility. So leaving aside any analytical ambition, here we start from a thematic classification. And then, so there is the use of Latin etymology, but then there is also this idea of like not taking, no, you know, I'm part of that generation that grown up with a commercial internet. So it's like I can take myself seriously only by being ironic. Like in this meme, I speak three languages: English, sarcasm, and ecclesiastical Latin. And so there is one of the element. It is this idea of making a divulgation of this topic, and so there is a very narrative and kind of a dimension which starts from stories, right? And there are a couple of stories that for sure got my attention on the topic, which are, I mean, the Cambridge Analytica scandal, the Snowden revelations, and maybe even the digital revolution is one of the grand narratives that we tell ourselves. So when I came here in Amsterdam, as an Italian, I could grasp the cultural differences with the Dutch. And one of the things you see, it is the fact that there's a constant renovation of the street, no? And this thing got my attention. We also discussed it in the interviews. And so with an heroic simplification, we may say that the Netherlands seem to be an infrastructural country, while Italy is for sure a country with an obsession for laws and litigations. And in fact, it's second only to Germany for the number of litigation cases. So it is on this infrastructural layer that the book focuses, because the Netherlands, as we said, has this kind of infrastructural focus. And it's something that I really found by asking the question to each author. As for the title of the book, The Politics of Platformization, it's of course a paraphrasis of an article of 10 years ago by Tarleton Gillespie, The Politics of Platforms. And this is an article that popped up in each interview, so it seemed appropriate to call it The Politics of Platformization. And actually, Anne Elmond, who was the first one who coined the term platformization, was supposed to be with us today. But when I encountered this term for the first time, it immediately clicked. It made sense to me. And so I kind of see it as an epistemology of the social, no? To grasp the technological and social changes of the last year. But there is also this political dimension. For example, the work of Bruno Latour has shown it very clearly in the propagation of scientific paradigms. So actually, what the idea was also to divulge these topics to a larger public. And how do you do that? You do it by telling a story. So I try to kind of turn this into a story. And you use metaphors. So what I've asked, another question, the second question is always, what's your metaphor to describe what a platform is? And we have this 13 illustration that came out both from the answers of the authors and from a literature review that I made. So I just very quickly assessed them. The first one is the platform as a political program and as an elevated stage. So this one is kind of the oldest one, and you kind of see it still when they say, the deplatforming of President Trump. But it is already like showing how the word platform is connected from its very origin with politics. The second one is the platform as a marketplace from the management literature. So platforms, they have kind of these multi-sided, these two-sided dynamics, which there are one group that produces services, the other one, and builds on the platform, the other one, human users. And so they are like markets, no? But they are not the same thing as the market of the neoliberal ideology. They are actually, as Professor Puel tells us, markets that are nested on other markets. They present recursive features. So they're markets in markets. And these already complicate the understanding of what a market is. Another metaphor would be the coordination mechanism, which is a fair one. Of course, markets are mechanism of coordination, but they are not fully decentralized in this case. They're kind of decentralized and centralized at the same time. Another metaphor coming from the software studies literature is the platform as Theseus ship or as Lego. So, of course, here we have the paradox of identity and change. from Theseus ship. How can I stay in the same while all my components are changing? Of course, platforms, they achieve these because they are reprogrammable infrastructures. And they are made of modules, so you can, like Lego, you can kind of recombine them and keep the identity. Another one that I've chosen is the gate maker. Now, this one comes from the management literature. The gate maker, I prefer it to the gatekeeper, because the element of novelty of platforms is, again, this fact that they create a new market in the first place, and then a market inside that other market. And then, of course, they keep it. Then we had this one, which kind of the oldest one, the walled garden. Then you had the octopus, which is one is fine, because when kind of the platform trick works and they achieve this lock-in of users and complementers, then, of course, the life of those people are very dependent on the platform. And then, you know, the platform can be seen as like of this Chtonian entity that ensnares the users. So you see there the tentacles and the people working. We have this one from the political economy literature, the owner of the shopping mall, also pointing out kind of these multi-sided dynamics, because then you have the owner that rents out the, you know, the places to the commercial activities, and then the commercial activities, they attract some consumers. Then you have, from the political economy literature, the platform as a vampire or as a shapeshifter. And of course, this is kind of the metaphor used by Marx of the capitalist extracting surplus value from the worker, but this time you have it from both sides, right? And it's interesting because here managers and Marxists, they completely agree on the description of the facts. They say, yes, those are infrastructures for extractions and for creating value, but then their normative evaluation changes. For the Marxists, it's bad, and for the managers, it's a new viable business model. Then we have the platform as a stack also coming from the engineering kind of discourse, so a multi-layer structure. And then we have the platform as a synthetic world. So you can see the human user there that moves in this cybernetic world. The affordances of the world are set by design, and they change, and they are remade continuously according to the very attempt of the user to use this instrument in creative ways to hack the system. Then we have the platform as a Leviathan, of course, like the most famous metaphor of power. Here, instead of it's a body, instead of being made of other bodies, it's made of cables. And then you have the platform as a catalyst. So this one is a very abstract one, and it's we find it actually in the economic literature. And they say, well, platforms, they aggregate these actors in a way which is more efficient than other organizational forms, and so they work as catalysts. But this also resonates a lot with an author that I've been studying for the last years, which is Niklas Luman. And Niklas Luman, he had made a critique of power, of the entire sociological tradition, by saying that basically power in modern society, it's not a cause, it is not a potential cause, but it is what accelerates processes. So it works as a catalyst. So it makes things faster. And so here, a happy person celebrating his better understanding of society after reading 30 books from Niklas Luman. And you can actually buy this T-shirt. So then, since the platform is not an analytical concept, it is a contested concept, and everybody was quick to point out, like, yeah, I mean, but you don't have the platform, capital P. You have only certain particular platforms in certain contexts. Does it still make sense to see platform in the world? Is the platform a useful term? And my answer to this is yes, I think it's a useful term. And I try to answer this by using system theory, as I said. And there are basically 2 points here. So one, it is this term allows interdisciplinary research. So if you look 10 years ago, you will have like legal scholars using a variety of different terms for, and what I mean is what now we call a platform. Then you will have software scholars having a long-standing debate of what a platform is, and they couldn't really communicate. Instead, when you use a metaphor, you can communicate. You can also look at the history of the network or at the birth of cybernetics, and you need a metaphor for interdisciplinary research. And the second one is that, for me, the platform, it is a mechanism for reducing complexity, as I was saying before, which is kind of the source of power for Luman. And if you look also genealogically, there's a point in which managers, they start to separate the firm from the platform. So a platform is not a firm, but a firm organizes itself as a platform. And there's also a growing consensus in organizational studies that this is kind of the case of understanding platforms as more abstract form of organization. And so the other line of the book, it is about not what I found. I found the infrastructure kind of understanding of platforms, but what I try to bring, it is this genealogical work that I've done on platformization, especially in socialist and communist country. Because, I mean, the history of platformization is basically, normally you start by saying, okay, Google has come, the Silicon Valley, and that's, of course, one part of the story. But another part of the story, it goes on in Japan, and another part of the story goes on in communist countries where they were asking from the 50s, how can we use computers to completely restructure our institution and our society? And at that time, there was not the computational power, the computational capacity to do that. But then Sir Stafford Beer, this guy who is not Osho, actually, he was an international consultant, right? Active in the 20th century. And he was the one who built CyberScene. And CyberScene was the first platform ever created, but it was controlled by the state. Digital platform ever created with telex machine and computers. And so he saw the manager as a designer. And he was the one, and that's kind of seen in the literature as some funky hippie thing, but I think it's historically very valuable. And so I try to bring this. And what he wanted to do, it was to redesign institutions thanks to three things: computers, screens, and cybernetic feedback with the people. And that's basically the definition of the platform nowadays. And he called that the liberty machine. So there's a very radical question that I think we should embrace, which is like, how can we, coming from Stafford Beer, how can we build a digital infrastructure that is democratic and that is also empowering, that is emancipating? Because with this comes a series of paradoxes which are extremely problematic, of course, but that maybe shouldn't stop us from asking this question. So Stafford Beer, very much, sometimes before the California ideology, was very critical of bureaucracies and in the way, like, it was, computers were introduced only to optimize processes, but he was saying, no, we actually should rethink the institutional system. So he saw design not as a rational calculation, but as a real-time adaptation. So here you see, for example, the value chain according to Natsuno Takeshi, a Japanese manager who claims to be one of the inventors of the platform concept. And you see how it's basically an ecosystem of circular mutual interactions in which values becomes a thing that is emergent. It's like an emergent property of the ecosystem. And on the right, you see Stafford Beer viable system model, which is was this technocratic and curatorial model for managing complexity in organizations. And they both have these recursive emergent features. So to come to the political conclusion of this. In 1973, Stafford Beer, so exactly 50 years ago, gave a speech. It was called Designing Freedom. And he was quoting this old song or tale from his youth that says, so it's thanks to that Magna Carta that was signed with the Baron Sold that in England today we can do as we like, so long as we do as we're told. So again, the paradox of governance. And who has been dealing with this paradox? It is modern constitutionalism, because in democracy you have a problem, which is how do you make sure it doesn't turn into its opposite? Well, the answer of modernity was kind of like we create a system in which we have a separation of power, a mutual system of homeostatic check and balances. And then we can go on. And how do we do that with a digital infrastructure, no? And with automation? So the political conclusion for me are these. I think that platformization is like a really important topic, but it is not debated enough at European level. Like there is another thing which is maybe more important, which is well, climate change and global warming. But those things are tied together because you need computers to track the changes in the climate. So actually, climate change is an epistemological achievement of computation. And you cannot have the one without the other. And then the more Latin overuse, this kind of the catchy sentence that we came up in the interview with Niels van Doorn. And it would be, this digital infrastructure, it's increasingly becoming the precondition for the exercise of all the other rights. So from the habeas corpus some years ago, they said, okay, habeas data, in the sense of the right of informational self-determination online, and habeas infrastructura will be kind of the follow-up to that, which is, trying to grasp the importance of all of this. So let me now ask all the authors to join me on stage to discuss this topic. So we have this Amsterdam-based research. And why did it came up here? Kind of Amsterdam was kind of the epicenter of this research. That's why I moved to Amsterdam and not to other places, I guess. And so we have platform studies and also platform theory, if you want. And platform theory, it is kind of, what I'm more interested in, because then, of course, platforms, they're not kind of an empirical thing anymore. If they're a theory, there's a detachment from the empirical condition, but you pay this price. But then you kind of have the advantage of having a philosophy for the computational era, no? So you can rethink some established concepts according to such theory. And we can go Deleuzian here if we want. For example, one beautiful formulation that I've been given is like platforms of immanence that I like very much. And the second point is about Europe's self-description, because we know that there's this discourse of the European Union in which we are kind of the democratic third way to the digital infrastructure. Is that true? To which extent? Because then there is the US, in which now they are like selling data, they are surveilling the world. Then we have China, and in China, they're surveilling the world, the population, and they are illiberal, okay. And then there's this self-description of Europe as the democratic third way. And so the final question would be, can we use platformization in the sense, of course, of a stronger intervention of the public or of someone that to go beyond the economic constitution of the EU, of the European Union, because then when you look at the European Union and you look at the values of the principles, they're not actually for protecting the institutional democracy. They are for protecting freedom of movement, they are for protecting freedom of establishment. And yeah, there are some values. I'm a very big supporter of the European project, but there are many criticalities. So thank you so much, and let's discuss it further. All right. Cool. So I'll start with Professor Powell. Thomas. With Thomas. Yes. So the question will be this Amsterdam-based research. How did it start? Do you think, like, I see it as the most European kind of, the representative of the most European kind of approach, which is, as we were saying, kind of mediating within. So if you could tell us something about this, thank you.
Well, first of all, of course, I want to thank you for having all of us here at your party, which is really nice. I could listen for hours to you, I have to say. You have a very nice presenting style, and I love the way you make all of these connections. So thank you for the presentation. And well, you already asked me this question before the session, so you wanted to me reflect on sort of the Amsterdam School of Platform Studies, or the Amsterdam sort of platform theory. Unfortunately, Geert is not sitting on the stage, because I would say he's probably the most qualified person to talk about this, but I will refer to him in a moment. So when you asked me this question, I was thinking two things. The first thing I would say, well, you asked me, is there something distinct, right, about Europe, and then we get to Amsterdam. So I think the first thing, obviously, which is quite distinct about Europe, which I hopefully we can get back to in this discussion, compared to the US or China, as the two sort of, main powers in the development of platforms, is the welfare state tradition, right? So very long history, strong welfare state institutions, at least historically, as well as a strong civil society, which I think defines Europe in terms of its relationship to platforms and to the internet more generally, as well as a strong tradition in terms of public service media. So at least for me, that's one of the starting points, to think about the ways in which platforms intervene into that. And I think that relationship between that tradition of the welfare state, civil society, public service media and platforms is a really tense one, right? For a number of reasons. First of all, because platforms at least promise to be more efficient, bypass these public institutions, and as well as providing the promise that we can do indeed things more efficiently and cut down, right, on public institutions, public investment. And I think that's deeply problematic. And I think that's something that European scholars, theorists have picked up on very early on, and understood that platformization, not the internet more generally, but platformization for sure, is also a vehicle of neoliberalism, I mean, to use that word. So that's the first thing, and I think that that's something that can especially be thought through from a European perspective. And then the second thing I was thinking about is sort of particular to Amsterdam, I think, and that's why I referred to Geert, because there's obviously this very strong tradition of activism and also artistic research and artistic activity in Amsterdam, going back to the late 1980s, 1990s, with the hacker conferences happening around that time, the Amsterdam Digital City, the Digitale Stad, which was very important, of course, very closely linked to sort of these civil society initiatives. And then the Waag Society, which started here doing experiments, as well as Mediamatic in the 1990s. So a range of institutions that were approaching this from a more emancipatory, activist / artistic perspective. And I think that kind of created the basis or the DNA of, new media studies, new media or digital culture in Amsterdam, and certainly also at the UvA and the HVA. I think that's represented by the New Media and Digital Culture program, as well as at the HVA by Institute of Network Cultures. So I think that's quite distinct. And from there, I think scholars who are trained in this tradition have put things on the agenda, right? So questions around labor and labor exploitation in relation to platforms. Questions around publicness, public space, and how that changes as a result of the rise of platforms. But also, I think, an interest in temporality, which I thought was very nice. In your presentation, you had a lot of sort of also historical references, which I think is quite typical for the ways in which at least Amsterdam theorists, scholars are approaching this. And then finally, I think a very strong interest in the technicity of the internet and of platforms, and questioning that also in terms of what that means in the types of connections, the types of interactions that are enabled by platforms. So those were my initial, but I know Geert doesn't want to be on stage, but hopefully you can comment this on at some point.
Cool. then let's go to him. Let's get him. Let's get him. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'm a bit hesitant also because, I'm the person behind this initiative and also the publisher. Obviously, I have a very ambivalent position towards the platform. Obviously, my last book is called Stuck on the Platform, in which I describe how it basically, subsumed and absorbed the dynamics of the networks. Obviously, we're still running the Institute of Network Cultures, and we defend the idea of organized networks or decentralized networks, etc. So, the question there is really, is there a historical necessity, right? At least there is a historic necessity, that's why we sit here, to study it, right? To critique it and to really go to the bottom of it all in terms of aesthetics, philosophy, technicity, as you say, right? So we're not just only looking at the funky, at the surface of it, right? And that's why I really like myself. I like the infrastructural turn, right? So I'm quite supportive of that, and I think which is kind of related a little bit to the platform, but not really. I would say what comes after platform studies is obviously critical infrastructure studies. And here I look at Niels ten Oever, who next month, is going to launch here in Amsterdam, the Critical Infrastructure Lab, which, for me is really a next level of what we're discussing here. But now I want to also welcome Stefania, who just came in. Yes, please, you were, if you like. Yes, please.
No, I just wanted to make a quick follow-up, and then I would happily leave the seat to Stefania. No, because especially what Thomas mentioned before, I think I can relate to it also biographically in a sense, because I started, I would say, as someone who would be called today computational social scientist or so. And actually, I mean, might be embarrassing for me to say, but during the interview, I was constantly wondering, why is Gianma interviewing me, actually? And while conversating with you, I realized, okay, maybe it does make sense. And that's because as part of the New Media Studies group in Amsterdam, I did engage with media in a more, let's say, critical, material, technical way, as Thomas was explaining, and that made me realize that studying society through platforms, which is what I was doing before, I mean, you can pretend to be doing it, and you can do it towards a certain extent, but you always also study society is part of platforms, so there's always this reflexive movement within it. And it's something that I was not aware of until I came to Amsterdam, and in particular in the Media Studies department. And then I realized, okay, maybe I do belong in this initiative.
All right. Who wants to follow up?
Yeah, maybe. I was actually quite surprised, and because maybe sometimes it takes an outsider to see your own perspective, right? Because you said, you wrote an interview and you said, I want to interview you as part of the Amsterdam School of Platform Studies. And I was like, oh, is there such a thing, right? And it reminded me a bit, I was a film journalist for a while, well, very briefly before I veered back into academic. And then you would always have these conversations with directors and you would say, well, tell us a little bit about the Romanian new wave that you're obviously a part of, or tell us about the sixth generation of Chinese filmmakers that you're a part of. And they would always sort of fence off, like, no, I don't want to be sort of reduced to a generation. So in a way, I was a bit surprised to sort of, hey, is there such a thing as platform studies at AMS? Is there this perspective? I never understood it in that way, but I'm really thankful for you of bringing that out, because indeed, I think if you look at the interviews, there is sort of a current thread sort of running through a lot of the work that we do, and of course, often we do it also together in one way or another. And I think it really has to do with what Thomas just laid out, that from the 80s or the 90s, we've already had this interest from sort of different groups for technology. On the one hand, of course, the hacker scene trying to frame technology as a public infrastructure very much, but also the NGOs and the city. Kennisland, for instance, I think played an important role in that. The city itself, where for a while, I think the platform, somehow it was sort of brought under the economic board in Amsterdam that was sort of really trying to develop it. But at the same time, the economic board was also very much tied in with what they started to call the Amsterdam approach, right? So I think this whole notion of talking about it from a value perspective is indeed something that, although I maybe had not recognized it as such, is something that was sort of really prevalent in Amsterdam through all these sectors. And it's an interesting place also, also because of the, how do we call it, sort of the, maybe it's not really a conflict, but on the one hand, we have sort of the more critical academic perspective. We have the governments and the NGOs who look at from, who want to sort of maybe indeed, as you say, make their work more efficient, hopefully, but sort of maybe undermining actually their own. But there is also a very strong startup scene, of course, in Amsterdam. And I think that all coming together is sort of a fruitful place to talk about it and study platform cultures.
Yeah, because, for example, in Italy, we have these very strong disciplinary divisions, and they kind of refrain from people from studying platforms. I think you go there and they say, okay, now you study the legal side of that, and you completely lack all the non-legal components which are absolutely part of the analysis, no? And just to answer, yeah, like my friend Jordi would say, the Amsterdam School of Platform Studies, of course, didn't exist, but as a Hegelian, I create my object of study, you know.
Well, you know, there's this article by Robert Gorwa, a couple of years back, who actually talks about the Amsterdam.
I know, I quoted.
Okay.
Yeah. I said I'm not the first one to invent it. There's someone else.
But he actually wrote it as a student, apparently, and he was like, okay, I actually created something.
Yeah, but then it means it's good because we came up independently, you know, to the same thing. And then I saw, okay, there's another person.
Sorry.
No, I was just thinking about Amsterdam from an urban studies perspective. That was also interesting to find a case study in the Netherlands to study platforms. And then Milan all of a sudden fall apart because it was not enough platformized. So I was also thinking when you presented, like if we can discuss to what extent are countries in Euros platformized and therefore cities, because then Amsterdam is definitely like a case study that is privileged to study those platforms. But I was recently reading in Milan, like Gorillas, Flink, all those new grocery delivery platforms have closed down, so they didn't work there. So the question is also the path dependency with the technological aspect that we already mentioned and infrastructure, without also mentioning Molly's at the end that they also place. They found their location here as a techno hub for microfinance solutions, but also as a kind of cities in which the social composition is quite particular, because then the social composition of Amsterdam is perfect for platforms to work. Whereas if you think about the grocery dynamics in Milan are quite different. So there are also elements of the urban, let's say, morphology that are interesting to discuss. And that's also was reflecting on platform urbanism as a part of this school within Amsterdam. So that's also something to add about the city.
Yeah. I don't know if someone has something to say. Otherwise, we can move to the next topic.
Maybe briefly. Yeah, sure. On the point about the Amsterdam School, actually last Friday we had a guest speaker at the EVIR who addressed us as the Amsterdam School as well, and a lot of us had that similar moment of, seeing yourself in the mirror. Oh, is that what we look like? And it was also interesting because it was one of the first times that I saw Thomas at the EVIR as well, because I think for the outsiders, our guest speaker thought, oh yeah, Thomas and Paddy and Natalie, they're all best friends, they know each other intimately. But in fact, between all these different departments, there isn't always as much, coordination or communication as you might like. And I hope, through events like this, and also maybe that brand, as it becomes realized by people, that might actually start to, God, brand is a very cynical term, right? But maybe brand in the literal sense of something that's stamped onto us, right? But yeah, we could talk about the economic constitution and stuff, and maybe I'll let you kick off those questions first.
And maybe one thing to just, what I was kind of struck by what you just said about sort of platforms failing. And I think that's an interesting question, right? So I think one thing we really want to stay away from is this idea that platformization is something inevitable, that it necessarily needs to go in a particular direction. There's always choices to be made, right?
May I have a question on that? Because more than 10 years ago, there was a wonderful conference in Turin on the university and the cyberspace. And then Bruce Sterling, who's a resident of Turin, asked this question of the academics who gathered around the cyberspace and the university's transformation, and asked them, it's like, you're academics, so your task is to network the dead with the unborn. So your perspective, temporal perspective, is like in hundreds of years or centuries, and yet you are forced to deal with concepts which have a lifespan of a hamster, and no one would be actually willing to fund a conference on the information superhighway or the portals or whatever was the fashion of the day. So I'm wondering if that is such a volatile environment, technologically, socially, politically, and we have also so much agency about which direction we take, then what is the relationship of research and academia to these concepts which may come and go, and what is the future of the Amsterdam School, if there is one, under such conditions? I have no answers to these questions, but this is always something that keeps me awake at time with my own blockchain research, if you like.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I think that's a question for all academics, right? And certainly something I'm struggling with. One thing I know is that for me, and I think for quite a few among us here, it's important to critically reflect on the terms that are circulating, right? So I think platform is a term that, well, obviously it's been circulating a lot over the last 10, 15 years, and there's a lot of investment in that term from a wide variety of different perspectives and interests and so on. And at least I see the role that I play and with my colleagues to critically examine that term and inject it sort of with understanding of the political, economic, social implications of the process that are legitimated through that term, that are pushed through that term, and so on. And so it might be indeed the case that we're going to trade in the notion of platform for something else, critical infrastructure. And before that, we talked about social media, right? And we didn't really use the term platform in connection. That's only somewhat later that term came up as sort of the overall label to talk about quite a variety of different types of services, which maybe are not that similar, right? So that's another question. Right? Are we really talking about the same thing when we use the notion of platform? So no real answer to that, but yeah.
I think Stefania has.
Sorry.
Yeah, sorry, I'm only joining now and with a massive cold. So I, probably have already discussed that, but I wonder, listening to all of you and to this beautiful Amsterdam school of various things, what's the political, really, what's the political validity of the concept you're talking about? Because the risk, and Amsterdam is this beautiful hipster city, and academia is also a fairly hipster operation, meaning, we like to look at ourselves, listen to ourselves speaking, and kind of really love the idea of being critical. But are we able, in our work, in our education, so in our work with students, to then go the extra mile and also become political? Mm-hmm. And what's the political validity, if you want, of the notion of platform, if any, or any other like notion, also connecting to what you just said. And I don't really have an answer. Maybe critical infrastructure is already has a little bit more political in it. Although, of course, there's also, again, the word critical, that sometimes it is antithetical to political. I just want to drop this bomb here.
If I can respond to that, maybe.
And then YOLO about it.
I think that's a really great point to raise. when I was listening to Gianmarco's presentation as well, he listed all these different metaphors that people use for platforms. And of course, a lot of what academics do is think carefully about those words and those categories which we apply and how do we choose to describe platforms. But there is one of those which sticks out as different than all the others which you presented, which is the first, platform itself. Because platform is a metaphor too, right? And when we can say, oh, platform is also like an octopus and it's also like a gate or a gate maker, et cetera, et cetera. But platform is interesting specifically because it's a term that the services use themselves, right? So it's not actually about what academics are taught, which phrases we use, it's something that's out there in the world. And that's what I think makes that Tarleton Gillespie's article so interesting, right? He talks about the politics of platforms. They say it's performative operation by these corporations. And what are they doing when they're positioning themselves in that way? So kind of my invitation to you, as you're going along with this project, but maybe to others in this room as well, is to return to that question and see what language are these services using? Because they're constantly like reinventing themselves, repositioning themselves. You know, so one thing that came up in our conversation was that 10 years ago, a lot of the gambit was this kind of Gillespian appeal to neutrality, right? And therefore no responsibility, no liability, etc. Now we're seeing, I think, very different frames being used by the platforms. So I've noticed a lot, you know, it's quite obvious when you see it everywhere, this community talk. The Airbnb community, the Facebook community. So what does that mean? You know, what are they doing there? We see the Facebook Oversight Board making the Supreme Court of Facebook, and there's kind of like the constitutional approach, like the state of Facebook, if you will. So I think returning to that question of what language are the platforms using and how can we critique that is one of the interesting and political things maybe that academics can do. Yeah.
Just to add one thing on this, because like here we had, I think, an evolution of the term, because that's where we started, like Gillespie pointing out that it was a metaphor that and those entities that were describing themselves as platforms and that had a political connotation. But then there was an explicit, I think, attempt by the scholars of give a different meaning to it, like, and make it, I don't say analytical because I don't like the term, but make it like more fair, I would say, like we are talking about something that we can kind of agree on, because then politically you have like two choices in those cases when those words pop up, like you contest the word, you say no, nobody should use it, we should come up with another word, or you accept it and then you try to change it from within. So that's kind of what the platform studies approach. I think it makes sense for this, and there's like a political choice behind it. I don't know if you agree, Tom. Okay.
Niels. There was a purpose to you sitting there. I see now. Yeah. You're going to speak to us as the father who will tell us.
No, I think like, so I start my the talking with Gianmarco with like that with the quote from Paul Edwards that platforms are infrastructures on fire. But I think we should also just go back, like putting the platforms on fire, burning them down, and then the interview ends with like a quote from Paradise Lost by John Milton, where Satan and his fallen angels get thrown out of paradise, and then they wake up like from this enormous fall, and they say, now we can really get to work, because now we're at the bottom. And I think right now we are at a race to the bottom. We see the platforms are not satisfied with the platforms themselves. They all want to get to deeper layers, to the supply routes, to the infrastructures, to like, so they know platforms are not enough. It is something that's already dissipating, right? So, and it's only getting real if it becomes really material. So we should be asking, and this gives us a moment to be critical, but almost like in a Kantian sense, that work can be, that it's really that we can almost get into creation of a new transcendental reality, and that's thinking about the infrastructures we want. And we are in this very strange political period where governments are also asking, what should our infrastructure politics be? Because the imaginary, the internet infrastructure imaginary has really clearly run out of steam, but we haven't replaced it yet. And this is, I think, what is our real so like, stop, I think critiquing is excellent, but we also should put some skin in the game by saying what we want and how we see the infrastructural distribution of power and resources. So, and I think this, as academics, as with time and space to think, you should help design that, because what is so weird is like the industry and the state doesn't have the imagination. So this is what we should be doing. We should be the imagination for the infrastructure of the future.
Yeah, thank you, Niels. I realized, I think we didn't really do a proper introduction round, right? So my name is Martijn Davao, and I'm at de Hogeschool van Amsterdam, the Amsterdam University of Applied Sciences. And I'm bringing that in because my perspective has changed a bit, because I started out at the University of Amsterdam, and then I moved to the Amsterdam University of Applied Sciences, right? And that also meant a shift from sort of the more critical approach that I find really valuable and important to the more sort of designerly approach, right, that you're bringing forward. So on the one hand, indeed, sort of trying to understand this platformization and looking at it critically and coming up with sort of concepts to understand that we can sort of feed back to policymakers, to industry, etc. But at the same time, I think the research that we're trying to do, and I also have to admit this is very difficult, but it's also to work with other kinds of organizations and see, okay, what could alternative platforms be? Like, what could platforms be that enable local commons organizations, for instance? And if you try to design them, what kind of dilemmas do they run into, right? So I think it's very important to complementary to sort of the more critical work. There is also a lot of attention for the more explorative sort of designerly approach. And I think they should go in tandem, right? Where the one sort of the more critical approaches help you think along of, okay, what is actually, what do we find sort of wrong or unethical or unproductive about the current structures? What are the concepts that we can think that through? And how can we reshape that from sort of different value perspectives?
Yeah. So, I think we can go on to the second topic, which is kind of more really the political in the sense of the politics. Are we in time? What time? No, we're fine. No, we're fine. No, we have time, right? Okay. Yeah, we will. Yes, so the point will be about Europe's self-description and what do you think about the this democratic digital infrastructure? Like we have seen, there's one part, the third part of the book about the new regulations of the European Union. They are indeed very impactful in a sense. They bring, some just very basic legal principles of due process into the platform design, if you want. But then some of the issues which are systemic, which are economic, they are never addressed, and maybe they cannot be addressed through a regulation. So what's maybe Balázs, what do you think about this, if you want, or anybody?
It will be at the last time. So I think that the third way of infrastructure is happening in Ukraine. Because that is where you see at the edge of hegemonic powers, where we see at the same time, so we see a rise between Sputnik and Starlink. Sputnik launched in October 1957, which emitted what Time magazine called those chilling beeps, led to the establishment of the Advanced Research Project Agency in the US, which then finally led to a network that could resist a nuclear strike, which was the internet. So the rise of transnational communication technologies, also the telegraph, is closely interlinked with militaristic power. So if we now look at Starlink and its emergence, then Starlink is actually not a communication network, it is a military controlled network. Elon Musk is just a distraction, and within Starlink that is managed by a 4-star general. So what we see is that we just accept communication infrastructures as a function of military power and control. It was the telegraph that transformed Britain from a colonial to an imperial empire. So if we want to go for a third and democratic way to infrastructure, we should radically demilitarize infrastructure.
Who's next?
Yeah, you addressed me, and I noticed that you made this subtle shift from platforms to infrastructure, and that is a key change, because then piggybacking on Neil's words, in that sense, if we start thinking about infrastructures. The COVID vaccine is a health infrastructure, and there are competing infrastructures around who's going to serve the world with that particular resource. And the same way, the Nord Stream is an infrastructure where someone blew it up to severe some global link of energy, and then Starlink, and then the internet, then all these digital things, or the financial infrastructure, or la-di-da-di-da-di-da. And so there, I think one of the key questions or dynamics that we see now is that this hope that there are going to be some global consensus and cooperation in these fundamental infrastructures, maybe under the umbrella of the Pax Americana, maybe some more evenly distributed manner where the Chinese, the Russians, the Europeans are able to serve this global unified planetary scale service stack with their own particular contribution is coming to an end, and it's unraveling with a frightening speed. But the question is that really an alternative? So is there the alternative to this? Is the unraveling, at the end of the unraveling, is there something that's the sovereign European whatever infrastructure that starts with vaccines and ends with social media, or there is nothing at the end because there is no alternative to addressing planetary scale problems and challenges with planetary scale cooperation. So my vote on that is that the alternative to global cooperation on the infrastructural level is chaos. And in that sense, I'm not that much focused on like the democratic bottom-up provision of infrastructures as long as it's working. And then we can discuss it.
You wanted to say something? Yeah. You're on fire, man. Anyway, no, but I mean, again, maybe to go back to what you said before, I think the core of this is it's obviously political, right? So I think we need to make it also political, right? These are political choices to be made about who is going to develop core infrastructure, and is that going to be corporations, either American or Chinese, or is there maybe a way in which European public institutions, democratic institutions can somehow affect the way in which that infrastructure is being developed. I think that's kind of, to me, that seems sort of to be the core choice. And that's become really urgent, right? Because platforms have transformed into almost inevitable infrastructures. And I think that's something we've seen over the last 10, 15 years, that some of these platform corporations are not similar to all of the other platforms that really have become sort of inevitable as an infrastructure. And therefore, it's become a very urgent political question, which, needs to be resolved politically. Right? In Europe, maybe to some extent the Netherlands, but it needs to be thought out at that level.
What I'm facing is that actually Europe is speaking very much with a split tongue, right? I'm part of many sort of those European programs, research agendas, creative industries agendas, right? And on the one hand, they say, yes, we have to do it the European way, and we have to promote public values, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But at the same time, we expect you to have an economic impact in sort of the old-fashioned way towards sort of economic growth. And that's really this, as we say in Dutch, the spagaat. I don't know what the English word is for that, I just forgot. The split, right, thanks. That often we, in these research programs we find ourselves in.
Can I just say one very quick thing? Yeah, I mean, that's very clear. There's one PhD student here who works on Gaia X, which is obviously a European attempt to build a cloud, framework for cloud infrastructure. And there you can clearly see, right, there are high hopes great public values at stake, yet in practice, when they really need to develop something, they start collaborating with Amazon and Microsoft and so on again. And you can see precisely what you're just describing.
And just to add something to that, very sad side of the story, someone one day has to make a study and just can't add up numbers, all the money, I mean, the projects, failed projects that European tax money projects have been spent on, with the illusion of creating the platform for, enabling sustainability in town, to collect garbage, recycle, whatever. I just have some very good intentions in mind, very good programs that were designed to then instill the new thing. And they didn't have a user base. There was no one there, right, to pick them up. And so, it's difficult to quantify resources as emotions and work that is put into that. But maybe just adding up the numbers, we realize that there's something that's gone deeply wrong there, and I don't know exactly how to fix it. Because indeed, Europe has a role to play, but exactly how, I really wouldn't know.
But that's also interesting whenever we talk about social cohesion or economic growth or digitalization and sustainability. Of course, if we want to solve digital solutions, sustainability, we all know that there is a conundrum in there, because whenever you create a platform, you also create so much digital waste. So there is also this new idea, of course, circularity. How can resources be circular? But then if the system in which they are embedded is still so hierarchical and so then controlled by global forces, that also fall apart, the project too. And then I also see that with the Common Fair and other platforms that are designed for communities with cryptocurrency, or with the attempt to create a currency for the community. But for instance, with Valeria, we wrote a paper in which we were trying to understand also crypto from platforms, how they work. And then, of course, if you are a tourist, for instance, you cannot use the crypto that you have in Barcelona, in Amsterdam. So there is already a clash between cities and not even in countries in that sense. So it's a question of scale also that it's interesting.
I'd like to say something briefly about infrastructures as well. It's not a discourse I'm really closely connected to, so I hope I'm not about to say something very stupid. But I find it very interesting discussion that platforms are framed in this way, or at least people would like to do so. Looking at it from a legal perspective and from a European perspective. So legally, I've looked mostly at social media regulation, and their platforms have been quite eager to adopt a kind of infrastructural frame, in the sense that they want to say that they're more like a telecommunications company. So this is actually a rejoinder to the claim, you are a media company. Because media companies, that entails lots of responsibility, and it would entail liabilities. You need to, make sure disinformation is removed, and hate speech, and all these other things. And so for the longest time, platforms had said, no, we are kind of the neutral carrier, right? We are just a dumb pipe. And so where I'm from, basically, that the telecommunications claim, or the infrastructural claim, if you will, is like an anti-regulatory ploy, which nowadays people are now more and more skeptical of. So I find that interesting. That's for me what the politics of infrastructural claims are. Might be different for others. And the other thing is, when you talk about the EU's relationship to infrastructure, again, I'm thinking like telecommunications itself is maybe an old-fashioned term, but telecommunications law. This came up last Friday as well in the EU, is not a proud tradition of kind of trust busting as it might be in US discourses, AT&T being busted up in the 1910s. It's a deregulatory politics of privatization. Telecommunications law in the EU is privatization that happened in the 90s of what used to be state companies. So I don't necessarily have the positive or optimistic view when we talk about the EU needs to regulate platforms like infrastructure. I see some problems there. Yeah.
No, so I think there are a lot of lessons from telecommunication, because if we go indeed back to 1865, the high times of telecommunications, then you see that the monopoly was in the US, but in Europe we didn't have that status of monopolization because it was ruled by states. And the states protected the interests of the telecommunication companies. So I love that you take this take, because we should think way more historical about infrastructure, because we really think that the world started with the internet because that's where we first felt free or hung out or like, but no, if we look at the situation at the late 18th century, beginning 90s, it's very much like the market is now. And we should also look at our city, right? I mean, the Netherlands was first a company, then it was a state. And it was a company that built the infrastructure here. The canal, our city has been built to facilitate profit making from colonialism. And that's what everything you see outside that is pretty, that works, has been paid and milled from. And not because a company, because the state wanted that. No, because a company brought in the money and then needed more space and built the canals. And then a state was built from that, and subsequently that state created international law that legalized piracy. I mean, this is how the state-private system works. But if it can function to optimize profit-making, extraction, and colonialism, we can also make it work for other ideals and principles. And that's what we should be thinking about, and thinking about is a holistic system. And I don't care if that system is inefficient and if we spend money. We need to create a new ideology. So on that, we'll talk about that on 13 and 14 April, the opening of the Critical Infrastructure Lab.
Okay, thank you so much. So, questions? Yeah, from you guys. Yeah, for sure. If someone wants to ask a question, yeah. Yes, we have first this one.
Yeah, thanks very much. So I had a question on the link between platforms and cybernetics. So I haven't read the book yet, but so I'm just going to base myself here on the book by Jean-Pierre Dupuis on the mechanization of the mind, where he basically makes a distinction between the first sort of cybernetics, which he calls the mechanistic cybernetics, and then a second generation cybernetics, which he sees as a more emancipatory type of cybernetics. And so the question I have is linking with the way that platforms function today as a sort of, let's say, decentralized, or to some extent decentralized mechanism, which, to some extent is also what this second generation, the emancipatory cybernetics, was arguing for. And yeah, to some extent we see that the pitfalls of this vision. And my question is, bringing back to what you put in a book, and you briefly mentioned in a presentation about Stafford Beer and the CyberSyn project, which was sort of the exact opposite. So a sort of very centralized system that bear a much more emancipatory potentiality in itself. So I was just wondering if you had some thoughts to share on that. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, the distinction that is made there normally is between first order and second order cybernetics. So, like, the critical distinction is when the discovery of the concept of autopoiesis, so like the self-reproduction of the system organization. And yes, then it becomes not more as mechanistic as the first one, because there is the inclusion of the observer in the system being observed. But this is absolutely taken into account by Stafford Beer, because Stafford Beer was in Chile. Autopoiesis was created by Maturana and Varela, and the background is basically the biology of cognition. So they were biologists, and then they applied the Merleau-Ponty phenomenology to to explain what life is according to them. So. I think Stafford Beer tries to take this into account, because when he builds CyberSyn, he, for example, says, okay, I have this platform, and I want you to use it for improving the conditions of the worker. So what do? I create a system of feedbacks, anonymous by design, that tells me when a manager is not managing, which is, of course, there is kind of socialism, so the manager is set by the state, when the manager is not treating the worker properly. So that will kind of have an automatic alert to the central room, and then you will make investigation in that place. Why that manager? So you see, in this case, you have this platform that works, at least ideally, to favor the worker and not the one that controls. But then, of course, when they try to build it in practice, I mean, it was all about the political conditions, but it was a problem of class prejudices. They didn't work. There was it was a total failure, basically. But in theory, they were trying to do that according to some autobiographies. Yeah, we had here one question. I don't know if anybody wants to add.
As an artist and a researcher, I was thinking a few things in the course of this talk and your discussions. I'm from Affect Lab. We do a lot of artistic interventions in neighborhoods and specifically very critical platforms. One of our projects was about WhatsApp in neighborhoods. It was called Good Neighbors. One we're working on right now is called A City Eating Itself in Less Than 10 Minutes, which is about flash delivery services in Amsterdam. And I was curious at this book, which, by the way, is really wonderful. Congratulations. The role of artists and creatives who work at this intersection of research and how we can be more involved. I'd love to know from your panel and guests as well. Thank you.
So that's a question for Martijn, for Letizia, maybe? You want to go first?
Well, that was interesting also for my personal research. I just finished my PhD, and it was about urban digital platforms, so not per se commercial entities, but platforms that has to do with the involvement of the grassroots, let's say. And whenever I was discovering and trying to inquire if there were a specific kind of like pattern or mechanisms, what I've observed, and that's in my research, so it's basically on two platforms. One is Furjebuurt, like the civic crowdfunding, and the other one is Common Fair, in which they have involved a group of people that were already involved in the grant machine funding for the Common Fair project. So namely, there were like a group of people from different cities that were able to capture the grant and then to develop their own project. And it's interesting to see how whenever you start searching, there is this layer of visibility in which people that, of course, have reputational and in a way relational capital to be part of the mapping are there. And whenever you try to investigate something that is not mappable, is then different. So it's also a question about the conditions for being alternative and how the alternative artist practices or artist practices can be involved, and if they want to be involved in that way, if it answers to your questions a bit.
Well, I like to think of it not so much as an alternative, but as part of the conversation. So
not per se alternative, but the conditioning in which the practices can flourish, those are alternative conditions, not those conditions per se. So Amsterdam, whenever, and that's the limitation of, for instance, my research, then whenever I want to find something that was not out there, like posted or Instagrammable, it's difficult. And then it needs like 5 years of research just to find practices that are falling under the artist practices.
Yeah, we often work in our research projects with designer or artists, especially because we work in domains which are sometimes called nascent, so things that we can imagine, but they don't really exist yet. So, for instance, we do a lot of work with well, not a lot, but some projects with local, we call them resource communities. So groups of people who want to set up their own shared housing system or their own energy company. And they imagine that they would want to use some sort of a platform to manage that in a commons type of way. The thing is, those platforms don't really exist yet. So they have to try to imagine what it actually means to organize all sorts of their interactions on the platform rather than sort of in interpersonal relations. So what we sometimes do then is we work with artist and designer, and they come up with a what's sometimes called a provocatype. So an art installation or an extreme exaggeration of a particular perspective in order to bring out, to start sort of have people try to imagine what that could be and start to have those conversations about, okay, what is it that we want and what is it that we don't want? And in those cases, we find that quite productive, actually. Yeah, Geert?
Yeah, I do want to say something about the absence of the aesthetics and the artists, because you know, we worked quite hard on that to include it in the book and failed, right? So and I think there's a reason for this, and it's not just because Gianmarco is a lawyer, you know. It's this, no, sorry, we really did our best. We tried. We got very far, for instance, to include an interview with Metahaven, and they refused. They said we are not part of this. We do not recognize ourselves into this, which you know, is very interesting, because 10 or 20 years ago it would have been very obvious and self-evident. I teach a lot about this stuff, particularly in art schools. And work a lot with artists, and especially in the Netherlands, we know, you know, things have been reduced by half. The art community is really not the same as it was a while ago. If you go to art schools, the platform dependency is very real. The precarity amongst designers and artists is very real. So it also means that platform dependency in those groups is very real. And so to question, let's say, Instagram, or to question, you know, YouTube, etc. Yeah, it's just not, you know, it's completely outside, funny enough, of the artistic imagination, which is very strange, but understandable, right? But it's also weird to see why are artists not avant-garde, right? Why are they precarious, and why are they? I look at you, you know, David. Why are they almost, you know, comparable to the drivers, you know, of Uber Eats or Thuisbezorgd? Yeah. Why is that? Yeah. Why? How did we come to that point in this city? Right, and we know that the systematic destruction of the art sector, of the independent spaces, of the squats, of you know, the subsidies, etc., has really had an effect. 10 years now, 10 years later, after the brutal, you know, austerity measures, right? And so, yeah, so and we are faced with that. I don't know if it is, you know, a huge gap, but at least, you know, we experience it in our work at the Institute of Network Cultures on a daily base. And what I call the apartheid wall between education on the one hand and the culture and an art sector on the other hand, instigated by the state 10 years ago, is a very, very real apartheid wall. And it's having now a long-term effect.
Yeah, I just want to add something real quick, because thank you for your question, because it was quite interesting to reflect upon. But then what I have as an answer also is how we can use Instagram, for instance, Mokum Crack. We can see how they use it to find solidarity, and it's very immediate, because you can really post an Instagram story and say, we need food, we need things for sleeping. So those are, in a way, the facade in which a more provocative way of being on the platform can be. And also I endorse the work of Platform BK for what they do for the solidarity, and they use the word platform, not per se being a platform. So I was a bit, I just cut up my answer, but yeah, I want to go to Jordi. And I was fed up to stay sit, so I just moved.
I would just very quickly add something, because it allows me to actually address one concern of mine regarding tonight, that there is an enormous but forgivable blind spot to this evening, and we focus now on platforms, and in the blind spot there is everything which is not platforms, right? The rest of the world, and for me it's very important to acknowledge this negative space or inverse space, that there is a world outside of platforms, there is a world outside of our concerns, and I'm actually very glad when artists are not thinking about which color the walls of the prison should be, but they are actually outside of this whole discourse and doing something completely unrelated, and not being engaged in this rather sad discourse of like, and maybe these are the places where all these alternative discourses are also being formulated, that you, Niels, were so passionately arguing for, outside of this whole discourse of platforms and technology and digital, and I'm maybe that's just a provocation. I'm actually very glad that there are very few artists who are not engaging with this.
Yeah, I just wanted to link this final part of the conversation about the role of artists, or like the living conditions of artists, and the more metaphors about the on the platform. We seem to be talking about social cohesion, right? And basically how, for example, artists lack this infrastructure or institutions for social cohesion, and we almost are talking about platforms have these things that we like, these technologically abstracted ways to replace methods or institutions of social cohesion with this digital infrastructure. And that even links to the other concept that was thrown at the beginning of the discussion, the welfare state, right? Another institution for social cohesion. So my question is, why? Why should we approach social cohesion this way, through this abstracted, technologically mediated way? Because I mean, perhaps that's why it fails when we try to apply like this, app for picking up trash, or whatever other thing is coming up, right? So yeah, that's just my question. Why should we do this? I can come up with one answer, but I'll leave that to you. I mean, my one answer is very obvious. But I also think it's like global warming, the climate crisis, right? Like, I mean, this is the Bratton argument. We need huge mass-scale platformization because the climate catastrophe is happening, and this is the only way we can engage as population, like as a global population, with the climate catastrophe. I think it's a very I agree. I think it's a very rhetorical and wrong use of, like, very wrong. I fully agree. Also a very abstract use of like what the climate catastrophe means. So yeah, but apart from that, like, do we gain anything from it?
I mean, when I brought up that notion of the welfare state, right, and to understand this historically, I think one thing to and I very much agree, right, so there is a real problem in terms of sort of building communities and how to engage with, how to relate with each other, and whether that needs to happen through platform or other ways. Right? But I think that there's the attack on the welfare state, right? The attack on all of these institutions that bind us together has been ongoing for a long time, right? So it's not happening since 2010 or 2005, since sort of the emergence of platforms. It's much older, right? It goes back to the 1970s, 1980s. And platforms have become a vehicle of that particular way of destroying basically these institutions and then replacing them with something else, which is basically the market. And so I think that's kind of what's happening. And then maybe you can bring in some other things, but that's ultimately, I think, the larger historical change that's happening.
Maybe you disagree. No, I think it's an excellent analysis, but I think like something that is missing is from this is obviously the role of the church. So so if you talk about social cohesion, then we had the state and the church, right? And we're breaking both down. It's like, and then we're very surprised if the market jumps in that hole, right? So it's like, and we cannot just say fuck the platform, because then something else will come into place if we do not come up with an idea. How are we going to rebuild an ideology that can replace the colonial state and the extractive industry? So it's becoming. So we need to come up with something that's not what we not want, but something that we do want, something to which we can like give enthusiasm and say yes, that we want to consent to, but that we are also really ready to fail in, because we're also like we don't want to take risk. So and we are very endangered, and so maybe this gives us the courage to take risks and commit to ideologies again that we spent so long time like decentering, problematizing. We couldn't escape this text. Criticism was not possible. But I do think actually that it's way more surprising, sorry, Walash, that the internet is actually still interconnected. What we see in Ukraine is that every time communication infrastructure is attacked, it's appropriated, but then again interconnected to the larger platform. And this is very different from previous interconnection networks. Like in the First World War, the first thing that happened was cables was cut. Second World War, same. So we're living in late capitalism. Through the sanctions, financial transactions with Russia are cut, but connectivity remains. So there's an ontological difference, but also something on which we can build.
Sorry, no, very, very quick, because you mentioned the word ideologies 3 times, and I mean, I think that there is an ideology that has been around for 150 years that maybe can provide some guidance on that, and happen to be the ideology of the only attempted experiment of a platform that would provide social cohesion. We are talking about cyber scene in Chile, and we know what happened to that experiment in general. But I don't know, is it bad to call it like that? It starts with M, and I would say that Marxism is a way to address the issue. And I find it rhetorical in this sense to call it which ideology could provide that space. Of course, this is my personal political view, but...
At the last point, let's talk about Marxism.
You have to be here for that.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, maybe to go back to answer, I mean, the work that we do at the University of Applied Sciences in my research group is a little more sort of, is on the ground. So we try to work a lot with people who call themselves the commons organizations. Whether they actually are or not is sometimes a different question. But I do think that there is a lot of promise in housing cooperatives, energy communities, etc. And when we work with them, we do find that they do need some sort of a management system or an administrative system, right? And then they often want to bring in a platform which could then actually enable that type of organization to work. At the same time, I think the point that you make is very spot on, because platformization also really runs the risks of transactionalization, right? That everything those people do becomes sort of a transaction on the network. So while we do the research with those people and try to figure out how platforms could help them run themselves, we actually find ourselves also often sort of discouraging them a little bit, saying that, okay, do not try to organize everything in a smart contract on the platform, because you want to force people to have that sort of relationality between them to solve it maybe in sort of a conversation. So yes, I think those platforms can help some of those alternatives that could be sort of promising alternative ways of organizing probably particular infrastructures or housing, etc. But there is this, I mean, the risk that you point out is actually there.
Okay, maybe we had another question in the back there. Yeah. Okay. That would be the last one, I think, because we are...
Hi, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation and for this very interesting debate. And I very much welcome your idea of kind of like having an infrastructural turn in platform studies. But I feel like there's this massive body of scholarship, infrastructure studies itself, which is much older than platform studies, which is kind of like overflying this conversation. I was wondering how the Amsterdam School of Platform Studies relates to that.
very general.
I'll give it back to our party leader.
Okay. By the way, I specify in the book, I call it the Amsterdam movement. Because then schools, they spend most of the time in managing their organization. You don't want that, of course. So your question, sorry, it's about the infrastructure studies being more older, and so? How do you relate to them? How do you relate to them? Man, I think it's connected to what we were saying before. Like, there's a need that I think they have pointed out, and the reference there is that good article by Plantin et al. Of understanding the platformization of infrastructure and the infrastructuralization of platforms. And that's, so like understanding platform as infrastructure is kind of the point of the whole movement. And I just think they are very much related. Nothing more to say about that, sorry. But maybe Stefania? Too late for that. Then let's drink something. Okay, thank you so much.